Hey guys, welcome back. So we've taken a little bit of a break from this, mainly because putting 4 screws together is not fun for you. So we kind of sped that process up. So we now have the 4 ball screws installed. Our side brackets our mid brackets are on. Our lower plates, Z motors, the pillow blocks, top and bottom, and our side brackets are all installed. Now, as you noted when I started putting this one here together, it's a little easier if you semi-assemble it first and then put it into the machine. Don't completely attach the pillow blocks top or bottom. It will make the job a little bit easier for you to kind of pseudo-assemble it outside and then put it in the machine, as you had saw me do this one last time. So as it sits right now, our Z-axis is basically complete. All the mechanical parts of it are together. So we're going to move on in this step now. We're going to move on to the X-axis. So we're going to be a little bit in the air. We're going to rearrange the machine a little just to make it easier to get some detail on it while we're putting it together. But we've basically got, there should be one bag in your kit that's labeled X-axis, which will have 90% of your parts in there. The only additional parts you'll need on top of that are your set of red brackets, your 60 mil axes stepper motors, and in your cable bag, you're gonna find your X axes end stop. So we're going to reset everything here a little bit to make it easier to see for you and for me to reach, because my arms will be tired by the end of the day. So we will see you back here in a moment and we'll continue our build. We're going to start on the X axis. So bear in mind, this machine is actually turned to the side for you guys. So in this particular case, the X axis is going to be moving toward and away from you. So we're going to be working on the brackets, the motors, and getting the pulley systems ready to go. So the first part of this is we're going to start mounting our 60 millimeter motors. We're going to start putting our gear pulleys on them, and we're going to start mounting them up to our brackets. After that, we're going to move on to the idler pulleys, which will go on the machine as well. Bear in mind, when you're looking at these brackets, they're actually mirror images of each other. Both brackets look like you can mount end stops to them. In this particular case, the way Modix does it, you only mount an end stop to the rear bracket of the machine. So if you're looking at these, when they're mirror images of each other and the adjustment brackets are on the outside, you're looking for this one here is going to be the first one we're going to do. This is the one with the end stop. Set this one aside for right now. We'll keep this bracket close and we'll start doing our motors. So the first step in our motors is we actually want to release our grub screws on the side of our motors to make sure we can fit the stepper through it. If you notice, the grub screws on these are set up at 90-degree angles to each other. If you look at your stepper motor, there is a flat spot on the stepper motor. So you assemble this in the following directions. You want the grub screws towards the motor, and you want to push this on the stepper until the top of the shaft is flush with the top of the gear. When you tighten your first grub screw down, make sure your first grub screw goes on the flat part of the stepper motor. So I'm just doing this by hand. I'm using my finger to feel that it's at the top of the shaft. I can fully torque down that grub screw, and only after that one is done, tighten up the one on the side. Both of them are going to be done the same way. Loosen your grub screws a little. If you have a look through the middle and you don't see any of the grub screw protruding through the center, then you're okay. Same thing on the stepper motor. Make sure it's level up here with the top of it, and then you can feel free to tighten that first grub screw down on the flat part, and only then tighten up the second one. Just so we don't get them confused, let's grab our end stop at this point and let's put that on our bracket so we always know which one is the rear bracket and which one is the front. So when this bracket gets mounted this way, The lever or the action part of your switch is going to be mounted towards the bottom. You do put it on the inside of the bracket, in other words, towards this bend. And then you grab your 12 millimeter long by 2.5 millimeter bolts. You put the bolt in from the outside. The holes are a little tight, but they will go. So you can feel free to snug these down. Don't tighten them up too much, just because the actual lever switch itself is plastic. Once that's said, we can pull our wiring out of the way. We have this bracket set up. So the next step is we're actually going to start mounting these motors into the brackets. For that, you're going to need your M3 shims and your M3 by 8 millimeter bolts. You're going to need 4 of each per motor. They do have them conveniently packaged so that you can find them fairly easily. So to mount these motors in, you need 1 bolt, 1 shim. Now, the orientation of these motors is important in this particular scenario. When you're mounting these in, the bracket is going to be sitting on the back of the machine like this. The rear one, the wire connection has to be heading towards the bottom. On the front bracket, when we do that, you'll notice the connection is actually rotated so the electrical connection is at the top. For the rear one, it does have to be at the bottom. Now, when you're putting these bolts in, don't tighten them down all the way. You're gonna wanna leave some slack in there so the motor can move freely back and forth the bracket. So your first one with the end stop will be set up like this. Either your adjustment's still available. The last step to this bracket is we're gonna utilize this hole right here on the side, and you're gonna put the M4 by 12 bolt in it. And just screw it in so that it comes flush to the back of this bracket. What this screw's purpose is, once you get this installed and you install your belts, you're going to want to tension them properly. When you tension them properly, this stepper motor will be sitting against this screw. So you can actually use this screw to push the stepper motor and get more tension on your belts. So you have to do this one more time on the front bracket. Just remember, this connection goes to the top on the front bracket. This one's on the rear. So we'll do one more. All right, so now we've got our 2 stepper motors ready to go. Now we're gonna work on the idlers, which is for the opposite side. So for this, you're gonna need one of your red brackets, one of your idlers with the built-in bearings in the middle, 3 plastic shims, or 3 plastic spacers, sorry, 2 of your shims, 50 millimeter bolt, and a nylon lock nut. So these ones go together, takes a little bit of finger finagling to get them in there. So I usually do them this way. I just let the bracket hang off. I'll put one of the shims in, one of the spacers. I'll push the bolt a little. Add my spacer. Then I'll add the idler pulley, and I can push the bolt through a little more. Add our second spacer. If that fails for you, like it's failing for me, grab a pair of pliers. It may make it a little easier for you. Just grab the shim, lay it on top of the bolt. Grab one of your plastic spacers. Lay that in on top. Grab your second spacer. Lay that in, and at the same time, you're pushing your bolt up from the bottom. So once that's in, there is a PEM nut in the side of this bracket. So you can actually just screw this bolt all the way through the PEM nut. And then on the other end, you're gonna put a lock nut on to make sure nothing loosens up. The critical part to this is don't tighten this bolt up too much because you'll end up deforming this bracket. These spacers are in there to keep everything comfortably at the same rate. You don't have to tighten this down all the way. I just tighten it down till it's snug. There you will notice a little bit of movement in the idler pulley inside. That's fine. But you don't want to start crushing that bracket so it starts coming out of square. Once that's done, tighten your nylon lock nut down on top. We're going to screw this in all the way. Okay. So our idler pulley is freely spinning inside. Our nylon lock nut is tightened against our PEM, and our bolt is sitting there, so you should have this configuration here. In the other side, we're basically going to do the exact same process, but it's going to be opposite. The order in which things go on the bolt are the same, but when you're finished, it will look like a mirror image of this one. So now that we've got the brackets all assembled or pre-assembled, we're going to install them onto our frame. So these are going to be set in the configuration. Remember that your gear drive is going to sit under your linear rail that we've already installed in a previous step. So these motors are going to install in this direction. The ones in the back of the machine, again, connections at the bottom. The ones at the front, the connections at the top. Once that gets completed, we're going to jump over and do our idler pulley, which is going to sit on this side and sits in this location here. First part of these step is let's get the T-nuts, the sliding T-nuts installed, and we'll get these all set up. I'm going to show you something specific for these. In the directions when you're putting these on, if you look at the Modix website, there is an orientation that you have to put these in. If you put them both in this orientation, you won't have enough space inside the rails to be able to get the bolts through the bolt holes. So when you do these, make sure you follow the orientation that Modix has listed in their online tutorials. Makes it much, much easier, and you won't have to try and pull these back out of your frame. So for this one, you're going to need 2 sliding nuts on the back of this rail and 1 sliding nut on the top of this rail here. Okay, so you grab 2 of your M4 bolts and your Allen key. I usually connect these to the T-slot, to the T-nuts first. Leave them a little loose. You can almost tighten them all the way, but just leave enough so you can slide it up to where its final position is going to be. Once it's in location, pull it very tightly in this direction so that it's tight against all extrusions. And then finally you can tighten everything down. This top one's a little tricky to get at, but you can get it with a longer Allen key if you need to. Finally, our motor is in this bracket here. So if we switch over to the other side, show you where the motor is going to go first. So if we set our motor up, you're going to have 2 T-nuts on this channel on the inside, and you're going to have 2 T-nuts up in this channel up here. So let's get that part prepped next. Now, these are the tricky ones. I recommend highly use the Allen key trick for this one, because if you drop them, they may drop down behind the linear rail. So make sure you get your Allen key in position, drop your T-nuts in, okay. Now you can move your motor over to where it's going to be. I usually try and line up my T-nuts behind the holes roughly before I get there, just because it'll make it a little easier to get everything lined up once you can't see them anymore. Okay. If your T-nut does happen to slide a little bit, just grab your Allen key, put it inside the hole, and you can recenter your T-nut so you can get the bolt in it. So same thing with this. Before you do your final tighten down, pull your motor and your bracket in this direction up here so that it's tight against both surfaces. And then you can do the final tighten down. So that's it for the X-axis, brackets, motors, and idlers. At this point, we're still leaving the motors loose because we still have to put our belts and everything, the rest of the X on. Next step is going to be the Y-axis. We're actually going to start assembling the gantry. We'll get that on. That will probably start our next video. So we will see you shortly. All right, so at this step, we're going to start on the Y-axis. The idler for the Y-axis goes together very similar as the idler we did for the X. The only difference is that we're actually putting the lock nut inside of the PEM on the opposite side of the idler. So it's going to be metal shim, idler, metal shim, 2 plastic spacers, and a nylon lock nut. When you're putting this together, put your bolt in, start to thread your nut on first before you finish it all the way through on the idler. The next step to that is going to be to put your stepper motor together. Now the stepper motor for your Y is a little different. The gear does not sit at the very end of the shaft, as you'll notice on this. The gear actually goes with the grub screws away from the motor, and there's just a very small gap in here between the gear and the motor itself, about 1 millimeter they recommend. So once that's done, we're going to start to move this into the bracket. So if you set your bracket down this way, I've already installed my M4 by 12 bolt on this motor bracket. And then when you put your motor in, your motor connector is going to sit towards the bottom or away from the end stop switch. So when we put that in, we're going to use our M3 by 8 bolts and our M3 metal shims. Same as what we did for the X-axis, we're going to want to leave these bolts just a half turn loose so that we can move the motor inside of the bracket for final belt tension. So it should be in this type of configuration here. So the next step in this, we're actually going to start building together our extruder block and base. So for that, we're going to need this large bracket here. So this bracket is going to sit on top of our linear block. All right, so when we start assembling our brackets onto the Y-axis carriage, this is a little bit of feat of getting multiple pieces together using only 2 hands. So the way this bracket goes together, if you double check your measurements, on your right hand side is the side with 43 millimeters of space, and the one on the left has 47 millimeters of space. Now that space is measured from the end of the linear rail to the end of the extrusion. So that just tells you this is the right side, this is the left side. Now, as we're putting it together, we're going to use our large mounting bracket first. Directly behind this mounting bracket goes our belt mounting bracket in this location. And behind that goes part of our support bracketry, which is going to be used for the wiring later on. That's going to sit finally in the very rear. So all 3 of these go together. Try and line up your holes all the way through, and you want to drop one of your 12 millimeter conical bolts through those brackets. So you push it through, get on one of your brackets, and then you can get on your final bracket. Now, once you have these brackets in place, you're going to want to bring this in on top of the linear block. Now, I found this a little easier if I actually bring the linear block to the edge of the table. Then I can lower it down over. And the first one's always the hardest. Past this, it gets much easier. So my first bolt is in, and I've bolted it into the linear block in the same hole that's located in through the brackets. At this point, I'm going to grab another conical screw. I can use the Allen key to actually center up all of the holes. And once I have it centered up, I'm going to put in the opposite corner to the one that I already have inserted. Once the second one's in, nothing will move around anymore. So getting the last two in will be fairly easy. Once you have all 4 bolts in, then you can give them your final tighten down. So a quick review, 43 millimeters on this side, 47 millimeters on this side, and your brackets go together in a large support bracket. Then there's a belt bracket, and then there's the wiring bracket, which is going to kind of hang out underneath. And this is what you'll be left with at the end of this step. All right, so now that we've got the main central gantry installed on the y-axis, the next step we're going to start to do is we're going to start mounting our motors and idlers onto this. The easiest way to do this, you do have to set up some T-slots in the channels. So the easiest way of doing this is set it upside down. And what you have to do is you have to put 2 T-nuts in the top, 2 T-nuts in the back on the close side. When you flip it around, you do the same thing. 2 T-nuts in the top and 2 T-nuts in the front. So when we put this together, we lay our bracket down here. Our idler side is going to go in here, and our stepper motor side is going to go in here. So let's go ahead and get that bolted in now. I'm just using our M5 by 8 millimeter. Now, one note that's going to make our job a little easier. Just going to pull off these end stops for our linear rails. In the instructions, it will tell you, the same as what I've said earlier, be very careful that this block does not come off the end of the rail. Once this rail is bolted to our block here on both sides, it won't be possible for it to come off. Now, when you slide your T-nuts in, if they're not perfectly aligned, you can just stick an Allen key in and just move the T-nuts so they're both lined up with the holes on the bottom. It'll make your job a little easier when you're putting these bolts in. So, similar on the other side. I'm going to start with our bracket here. When you put this bracket in place, you'll notice the edge of the extrusion is here. Make sure the edge of this extrusion is flush with the upright of this side bracket. And just snug it down. We may have to do some adjustment on it when we actually mount it on the machine. Lay it to its back. Or sorry, to its front. And then we'll finish getting these installed. This particular T-nut, I'm going to rotate it around the other way. So, on this, got all of our brackets set up. Inserted. There's 2 extra T-nuts you need here on the top. These will have to be on the idler side. So these 2 are going in for this small bracket here. And all this bracket does is adds additional strength for the joint that you're producing here on this end. So all of these bolts that I'm putting in, I'm tightening them down, but then I'm backing them off half a turn because we will have to do some final adjustment before we tension everything up completely. So your y-axis support bracket, after you get it bolted to the top of the rail here, put your 2 bolts in the front. And again, just put them in finger tight at this point. We'll tighten them all down shortly. All right, so this is our Y-axis gantry. It's done, finished, ready to be installed on the machine. For that, we need 8 of our M3 by 6 millimeter conical bolts. Make sure we have the right Allen key. And now we're gonna switch over and go bolt this up to the machine. So over here on our machine, we're gonna lay our gantry. Is basically going to go on top of our 2 linear blocks like this. So in prep for that, let's lay our gantry here for a moment. I'm gonna put 1 screw on my Allen key, and I'm gonna get another one ready over here to go. Set it up through here. I'm basically putting it in about a full turn, just enough to support that side so that I can get this side in. So on that side, I put the screw in the back of the block, and this one here, I'll put it in the front. Again, just while we're doing setup. Now, my bolts are a little tight, so I'm gonna pull the gantry out. That's why I've left those bolts a little loose. Just gonna pull the gantry this way slightly so I can get 1 screw in over here, and then we'll actually center everything up in the machine. Okay. So again, these screws are only in there by, like there's 1 screw on each side. It's a little wobbly right now, but we still have to get everything centered up in these gantries before we can finalize where everything is gonna sit. So I've got 1 tight one over here. Let's have to loosen this up for a moment. So what we're looking for on this, when we finally get this centered up properly, we want this face of the extrusion to come flush. Let me grab an Allen key here so I can point it out to you. So I want the edge of this extrusion, the right side, your left side of the extrusion, wants to be flush with this surface. We will end up with a little bit of a gap over here, that's okay, but we want it to be flush on this side. So now I've got everything pseudo set up here, okay. So at this point, let's get a couple more of these bolts started in the lower blocks. So I'm doing them in 2 opposite corners, just because I want it to hold it without having to worry about it falling. But I still will have to move it a little bit for adjustment in the next step. So the next thing you're gonna need to do now is you're gonna need these 2 calibration jigs. Modix includes these in all of their kits that they send you. The STL files, if they happen to get broken in transit or you drop one step on it, the STL files are available from the customer downloads or the customer care portal. You can download these STL files from there. So what essentially we're gonna do with these is we're gonna bolt them to the Y gantry. We're then going to bolt them to the back of the frame on that side towards the camera. Once these are in place, then we're gonna square everything up based on the frame, tighten all of our bolts down, and then we know that our Y gantry is parallel to our frame. So let me get a little bit of prep work done and we'll be right back.